The night was pitch black, the kind of dark that swallows you whole, out on the backroads of Mercy County, where the stars barely peek through the heavy pines. It was 2009, and Sheriff Amos Reed, a grizzled man with a heart as big as his badge, was riding shotgun with his deputy, Clara Hayes, a sharp young woman who'd only been on the force a year. They were working the graveyard shift, patrolling the quiet stretches of Route 17, where nothing ever happened until it did. At 2:37 a.m., their cruiser's radio crackled with a routine check-in. Amos's voice, steady as ever, reported they were near the old Miller farm. Then, silence. No static, no follow-up, just nothing. By sunrise, their cruiser was found abandoned on a dirt turnout, doors open, lights still flashing, and not a single trace of Amos or Clara. No footprints, no tire marks, no witnesses. It was like the night itself had taken them. For 16 years, Mercy County whispered about that night. Some said it was foul play, others swore it was something darker, something that didn't belong in the light of day. Families begged for answers, the town held vigils, but the mystery of the vanished sheriff and deputy stayed buried. Until now. Last month, a hiker stumbled across an old outhouse, half collapsed and forgotten, deep in the woods near that same stretch of Route 17. Inside, tucked under a rotting floorboard, was something that turned this cold case red hot. What was it? Something that could finally explain what happened to Amos and Clara, or open a door to an even darker truth. Let me take you back to that night, to the moments before everything changed. Amos Reed wasn't just a sheriff, he was Mercy County's anchor. At 52, he'd seen it all: bar fights, petty thefts, the occasional lost hiker. His laugh could fill a room, but his eyes carried the weight of every call he'd ever answered. Clara, on the other hand, was his opposite in every way: young, barely 26, with a fire in her gut to prove herself. She'd grown up in Mercy, knew every backroad like the back of her hand, and had a knack for talking down even the rowdiest drunks at the local bar. Together, they were unstoppable, or so the town thought. That night, they'd been called out to check on a strange light reported near the Miller farm, an abandoned place that kids swore was haunted. It was supposed to be a quick stop, a routine sweep. But something went wrong. Horribly wrong. The cruiser's dashcam was blank, the radio logs cut off mid-sentence, and the only clue left behind was a single, muddy boot print near the turnout, too small to belong to Amos, too big for Clara. 4 years, that boot print haunted the town, a silent taunt from whoever, or whatever, knew the truth. Now, let's shift gears for a moment, because this story isn't just about a vanishing. It's about people, choices, and the kind of moments that ripple through time. Around the same time Amos and Clara disappeared, another story was unfolding, one that seemed small but would tie into this mystery in ways no one could have predicted. On a crowded bus in a nearby city, a black teenager named Marcus Tate, just 17, stood up to give his seat to a pregnant white woman named Ellen Carver. Marcus was a kid from the wrong side of the tracks, raised by a single mom, always keeping his head down to avoid trouble. Ellen, exhausted and grateful, scribbled something on a scrap of paper and handed it to him before she got off the bus. That note, those few words, changed Marcus's life forever. What did it say? Why did it matter? And how does a random act of kindness on a bus connect to a sheriff and deputy vanishing into the night? The answers lie in that outhouse, in what was found under those floorboards, and in the secrets Mercy County has kept buried for 16 years. As we dive into this story, picture Mercy County in 2009, a small town where everyone knows your name, but not always your business. The kind of place where folks leave their doors unlocked but still whisper about strangers passing through. Amos and Clara weren't just law enforcement, they were family to this town. Amos had a wife, June, who still sets a place for him at dinner every night, hoping he'll walk through the door. Clara's little brother, Tim, was only 10 when she vanished, and has spent his life chasing shadows, trying to find her. The town searched for them for months, volunteers combed the woods, divers dragged the river, and psychics even showed up, claiming they could feel something off near the Miller farm. But nothing turned up. Not a badge, not a scrap of clothing, nothing. The case went cold, and Mercy County tried to move on. But you don't just forget people like Amos and Clara. And you don't ignore a discovery like the one in that outhouse. What was it about that outhouse, anyway? It wasn't just some random shack. It sat on land tied to the Miller family, who'd left town decades ago under a cloud of rumors, something about a scandal, a fight, maybe even a crime no one could prove. The outhouse itself was a relic, barely standing, covered in vines and rot. When that hiker pried up those floorboards, what he found wasn't just a clue, it was a bombshell. Something that made the sheriff's office reopen the case, something that had detectives driving out to that lonely stretch of Route 17 in the middle of the night. Was it a letter? A photograph? A piece of evidence that pointed to someone in town? Or was it something stranger, something that could explain why Amos and Clara's cruiser was left with its lights on, doors open, like they'd stepped out and vanished into thin air? And then there's Marcus and Ellen. That moment on the bus wasn't just a passing kindness. Marcus, a kid who'd been told his whole life he'd never amount to much, carried that note in his pocket for years. It wasn't money or a job offer, it was something deeper, something that gave him a spark of hope he'd never had before. Ellen, meanwhile, wasn't just a random stranger. She had her own story, her own secrets, and a connection to Mercy County that no one saw coming. How does a note from a pregnant woman tie into a 16-year-old mystery? Did Marcus know something about that night? Did Ellen? And why did it take a crumbling outhouse to bring it all back to the surface? Here's where it gets real. Mercy County isn't just a place, it's a character in this story. It's a town that holds onto its secrets like a grudge. The woods around Route 17 are thick, the kind of place where you can scream and no one hears you. The Miller farm, with its sagging barn and that eerie outhouse, has always felt wrong to folks who pass by. Kids dared each other to sneak out there, but no one stayed long. There were stories, whispers of lights in the woods, strange sounds, even sightings of figures that didn't look quite human. Amos and Clara knew those stories, but they weren't the type to believe in ghosts. They went out there that night expecting a prank, maybe some kids messing around. Instead, they found something or someone that didn't want to be found. 16 years later, the truth is clawing its way out. That outhouse discovery has people talking again, digging into old files, knocking on doors, and asking questions they were too scared to ask back then. Was it a crime of passion? A cover-up? Or something no one in Mercy County wants to admit? And what about Marcus? He's not that kid on the bus anymore, he's a man now, carrying the weight of that note and a past he's never fully escaped. Ellen's note wasn't just words, it was a key, a thread that ties back to Amos and Clara, to that night, to the outhouse. But what does it unlock? And why did it stay hidden for so long? I'm not going to lie, this story is heavy. It's about loss, hope, and the kind of secrets that can tear a town apart. But it's also about people: Amos and his unwavering sense of duty, Clara and her fearless heart, Marcus and his quiet strength, Ellen and the choice she made on that bus. As we unravel this mystery, we'll walk those dark roads together, piece by piece, until we get to the truth. But I'm warning you now, the truth might not be what you expect. It might not even be what you want. What was found in that outhouse? How does a simple act of kindness connect to a 16-year-old disappearance? And what really happened on Route 17 that night? Stick with me, because the answers are coming and they're going to change everything. The air in Mercy County always felt heavier after Amos and Clara vanished. It was like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for answers that never came. Back in 2009, Mercy was the kind of place where time moved slow, where folks gathered at the diner on Main Street to swap stories over coffee and pie. But after that night, the diner got quieter, the stories got darker, and the trust that held the town together started to fray. People looked at their neighbors a little differently, wondering who might know something, who might have seen something. The disappearance wasn't just a mystery, it was a wound, one that never quite healed. Amos Reed had been more than a sheriff. He was the guy who'd pull over to help you change a tire, who'd show up at your kid's baseball game just to cheer. Clara Hayes was the hometown girl who'd made good, the one who'd come back after college to serve the place that raised her. Their absence left a hole, and for 16 years, Mercy County tried to fill it with rumors, theories, and half-baked leads that went nowhere. But now, with that outhouse discovery, the wound was open again, and the town was buzzing with a mix of hope and dread. Let's rewind to 2009, to the days leading up to that fateful night. Amos was nearing retirement, though you'd never know it from the way he carried himself. At 52, he still wore his sheriff's hat tipped just so, and his boots were always polished, a habit from his army days. He'd been sheriff for nearly 2 decades, elected time and again because people trusted him to keep the peace. His wife, June, ran the local bakery, and their house on Oak Street was always open to anyone who needed a hot meal or a kind word. But Amos had been quieter that summer, folks noticed. Not distant, just thoughtful. Like something was weighing on him. He'd been spending more time out at the station, poring over old case files, though no one could say why. Clara, his deputy, was his shadow that year. She was tough, quick with a joke, but serious when it mattered. She'd grown up in a trailer park on the edge of town, raised by a mom who worked double shifts at the mill. Clara had fought her way out of hard times, earning a criminal justice degree and a badge that made her mom cry with pride. Together, Amos and Clara were a team, him with his steady wisdom, her with her sharp instincts. But that night, something broke them. The call about the strange light near the Miller farm came in just after midnight. It was a local, old man Jenkins, who lived a mile down Route 17. He'd been out on his porch, smoking a cigarette, when he saw a faint glow flickering through the trees. Looked like a lantern or something, he told the dispatcher, his voice shaky. Ain't nobody supposed to be out there. The Miller farm had been empty since the early 80s, when the family packed up and left after a messy divorce and whispers of something worse. The place was a wreck, overgrown fields, a barn that leaned like it was drunk, and that outhouse, sitting lonely at the edge of the property. Kids used to sneak out there on dares, claiming they heard voices or saw shadows moving in the windows. Amos and Clara didn't buy into ghost stories, but they knew the farm's reputation. They took the call seriously, figuring it was probably teenagers messing around, maybe starting a fire. They radioed in, said they'd check it out, and drove into the dark. That was the last anyone heard from them. The next morning, when the cruiser was found, the town went into a panic. The doors were wide open, the engine was still warm, and the radio was silent. Amos's hat was on the driver's seat, Clara's flashlight was on the ground nearby, and that single, muddy boot print was pressed into the dirt just off the road. It was too big to be Clara's, too small to be Amos's, and it didn't match any of the volunteers who searched the area. The county brought in dogs, helicopters, even a team from the state police, but the woods gave up nothing. No blood, no tracks, no sign of a struggle. It was like Amos and Clara had stepped out of the cruiser and walked into another world. June, Amos's wife, refused to believe they were gone. She'd stand on her porch every night, staring down the road, waiting for his headlights. Clara's brother, Tim, was just a kid then, but he'd sneak out to the Miller farm, sitting in the tall grass, hoping his sister would come back. The town rallied around them, but as weeks turned to months, hope faded. The case went cold, and Mercy County learned to live with the unanswered questions. Now, let's talk about Marcus Tate and that moment on the bus. Marcus was 17, lanky, with a quiet way about him that made people underestimate him. He'd grown up in a rough part of the city, an hour's drive from Mercy, where the streets were loud and the odds were stacked against you. His mom, Denise, worked as a nurse's aide, pulling long hours to keep the lights on. Marcus was a good kid, always helping out, but he kept to himself. That day on the bus, it was packed, standing room only, and Marcus was squeezed near the back, his backpack heavy with library books. Ellen Carver, the pregnant woman, was struggling to stay upright as the bus lurched along. She was in her 30s, pale, with tired eyes and a hand resting on her belly. Marcus didn't think twice, he stood up, offered her his seat, and she gave him a small, grateful smile. As she got off at her stop, she pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand. "Read this later," she whispered, and then she was gone. Marcus didn't open it right away. He shoved it in his pocket, figuring it was just a thank you. But when he finally read it, alone in his room that night, his hands shook. Those words weren't just kind, they were life-altering. They gave him something he'd never had before, a sense of possibility. Ellen Carver wasn't just a stranger on a bus. She'd grown up in Mercy County, same as Clara, though she'd left years ago to escape a past she didn't talk about. Her family had ties to the Miller farm, distant cousins or something, though no one could quite remember how. Ellen was back in the area that summer, staying with a friend in the city, waiting for her baby to be born. She was guarded, always looking over her shoulder, like she was running from something or someone. That note she gave Marcus wasn't random. It was deliberate, a message meant for him, though he didn't understand why at the time. Marcus carried it with him, rereading it whenever life got heavy. It wasn't money or a promise of a job, it was something deeper, something that made him believe he could be more than what the world expected of him. But what did it say? And why did Ellen, a woman with her own secrets, choose Marcus to carry that weight? Back in Mercy, the Miller farm was more than just a creepy old property. It had a history, one the town didn't like to talk about. Old Man Miller, the last to live there, had been a recluse, the kind of guy who'd chase kids off his land with a shotgun. There were stories about him, rumors of fights with his wife, debts he couldn't pay, even whispers of something illegal going on in that barn. When the family left, they didn't just move, they disappeared, leaving behind a house full of furniture and that outhouse, untouched, like they couldn't get away fast enough. By 2009, the farm was a ghost of itself, but it still drew attention. Kids would sneak out there, spray painting the barn or breaking windows, and every so often, someone would report a strange light, just like Jenkins did that night. Amos and Clara weren't the first to check it out, but they were the last. When that hiker found the outhouse last month, it was like a match struck in the dark. He wasn't looking for anything special, just exploring, taking photos for his blog. The outhouse was barely standing, its wood soft with rot, the door hanging off its hinges. He nearly walked past it, but something caught his eye, a loose floorboard, sticking up like it had been pried open and never set right. Curiosity got the better of him, and when he lifted it, he found a small, metal box, rusted but intact. Inside was something that made his blood run cold. He didn't touch it, just called the sheriff's office and waited, his hands shaking as he stood guard over the find. When the deputies arrived, they sealed off the area, and word spread like wildfire. Whatever was in that box, it was enough to bring state investigators back to Mercy, enough to make June Reed cry for the first time in years, enough to make Tim Hayes drive out to the farm and stare at that outhouse like it held his sister's ghost. The town started talking again, and the theories came fast. Some said it was a confession, written by someone who'd been carrying guilt for 16 years. Others thought it was evidence, maybe a piece of Amos's badge, or Clara's notebook, something that proved they'd been at the farm. A few whispered about something stranger, something that didn't fit the neat lines of a police report. The boot print, that single, muddy mark, came up again and again. Whose was it? A third person? Someone who'd lured Amos and Clara out there? Or was it something else entirely, something that didn't belong to a person at all? The woods around the Miller farm had always felt wrong, like they were watching you. Hunters avoided them, dogs wouldn't go near them, and even the bravest kids wouldn't stay past dusk. Whatever happened that night, it wasn't just a crime, it was a puzzle, one that Mercy County had been trying to solve for 16 years. Marcus Tate, meanwhile, was no longer the kid from the bus. By 2025, he was 33, working as a mechanic in the city, living a quiet life with his mom. But he'd never forgotten Ellen's note. It was still in his wallet, folded and worn, a reminder of the moment that changed him. He'd gone back to school, gotten his GED, and built a life he was proud of. But he'd also heard about the outhouse discovery, and it stirred something in him. He hadn't been to Mercy County in years, but he knew the stories about Amos and Clara. Everyone did. What he didn't know was how his own story tied into theirs, how that note in his pocket was a thread in a much bigger web. Ellen Carver had vanished not long after that day on the bus, leaving no trace except for the baby she'd been carrying. Where did she go? And why did her note to Marcus feel like a piece of the puzzle? The sheriff's office wasn't talking, not yet. They'd cordoned off the Miller farm, and deputies were posted at the entrance, turning away curious locals. But rumors slipped through the cracks. Some said the box in the outhouse held a map, others said it was a photograph, grainy but unmistakable. A few swore it was a letter, written in a hurry, with names that made the investigators go pale. Whatever it was enough to pull Tim Hayes back to Mercy, enough to make June Reed start asking questions she'd been too afraid to ask before. And it was enough to bring Marcus Tate, a man who'd never set foot in Mercy County, to to the edge of a mystery he didn't know he was part of. As the town waited for answers, the woods around Route 17 seemed to grow darker. People swore they saw lights again, flickering through the trees, just like that night in 2009. Old man Jenkins, still alive and still smoking on his porch, said he heard voices, low and urgent, coming from the direction of the Miller farm. The diner was packed again, but the conversations were hushed, filled with words like cover-up and curse. Mercy County was waking up, and with it, the secrets it had buried for 16 years. What was in that box? Who left it there? And what did it have to do with a sheriff, a deputy, a black teenager, and a pregnant woman on a bus? The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows of the Miller farm, waiting to be found. But some truths, once uncovered, can't be put back. Mercy County was a town that thrived on whispers, but in the weeks after the Outhouse discovery, those whispers turned into a roar. The metal box found under the rotting floorboards had cracked open a 16-year-old wound, and nobody could look away. The sheriff's office was tight-lipped, but that only fueled the fire. At the diner, folks leaned over their coffee cups, trading theories about what was inside: a letter naming names, a blood-stained badge, maybe even a map leading to where Amos Reed and Clara Hayes had gone that night in 2009. The Miller farm, once just a creepy footnote in local law, was now the center of everything. Deputies guarded the property day and night, their cruisers parked along Route 17, but that didn't stop curious locals from driving by, slowing down to peer into the woods. The air felt charged, like a storm was brewing, and everyone in Mercy knew the truth was close, too close for comfort. But the truth, whatever it was, wasn't ready to show itself. Not yet. June Reed hadn't slept right since the news broke. At 68, she still ran the bakery, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough each morning. But her heart wasn't in it anymore. She'd kept Amos's memory alive all these years, setting his place at the dinner table, folding his old sheriff's jacket over the back of his chair. When the call came about the outhouse, she'd dropped a tray of muffins, the crash echoing through the empty shop. The deputy on the phone wouldn't say much, just that they'd found something significant and needed her to come identify a few items. June drove out to the station, her hands gripping the wheel, her mind racing. Was it Amos's wedding ring? His pocket knife, the one she'd given him for their 10th anniversary? Or was it something worse, something that would confirm he wasn't coming home? At the station, they showed her a photograph not of the box's contents, but of the box itself, rusted and dented, with a faint scratch mark on the lid that looked like a letter. A, she whispered, her voice breaking. It could have been Amos's initial. Or it could have been nothing. They wouldn't let her see more, and she left feeling like the ground had shifted under her feet. Tim Hayes, Clara's little brother, was no longer the 10-year-old kid who'd sat in the grass by the Miller farm, waiting for his sister. Now 26, he was a welder, living in a small apartment above the hardware store. He'd never stopped looking for Clara, even when everyone else had. Tim had spent years chasing leads: old newspaper clippings, grainy security footage, even a psychic who'd claimed Clara was still close. Nothing panned out, but he kept going, driven by a promise he'd made to himself the day she vanished. When he heard about the outhouse, he was out at the farm within hours, standing just beyond the police tape, staring at that crumbling shack. The deputies told him to go home, but Tim wasn't budging. He'd seen something in the woods that day, something he hadn't told anyone back then. A shadow, moving fast, too tall to be Clara, too thin to be Amos. He'd been too scared to speak up, a kid afraid of sounding crazy. Now, he wondered if that shadow was tied to the box, to the boot print, to whatever had taken his sister. Tim started asking questions around town, knocking on doors, talking to old-timers who'd known the Millers. Most slammed their doors shut, but one, a retired postman named Earl, let slip something odd: the Millers hadn't just left town in the 80s. They'd been run out, after a fight with someone powerful. Who? Earl wouldn't say, but his eyes darted to the sheriff's station across the street. Meanwhile, Marcus Tate was wrestling with his own ghosts. He'd seen the news about Mercy County on his phone, a small article about the outhouse find, and it hit him like a punch. He hadn't thought about Ellen Carver in years, not consciously, but that note she'd given him on the bus was still in his wallet, its edges soft from years of handling. Marcus had built a good life, steady job, A girlfriend who made him laugh, a mom who was finally proud. But that note had been his anchor, a reminder that one small moment could change everything. He'd never told anyone what it said, not even his mom. It wasn't a secret, exactly, just something private, something that felt too big to share. Now, with the Mercy County story blowing up, he couldn't shake the feeling that Ellen's note was connected. He didn't know how, but the name Miller Farm stuck in his mind, like a song he couldn't unhear. Marcus started digging, scrolling through old articles, searching for Ellen Carver's name. He found nothing, no record of her after 2009, no trace of the baby she'd been carrying. It was like she'd vanished, just like Amos and Clara. But then he stumbled on a forum post, buried deep in a true crime thread, mentioning a woman matching Ellen's description seen near Mercy County that summer, arguing with a man in a pickup truck. The post was anonymous, but it mentioned the Miller farm. Marcus's hands went cold. Was Ellen tied to the farm? To the disappearance? And why had she chosen him, a random kid on a bus, to carry her words? Back in Mercy, the tension was thickening. The sheriff's office had called in a forensic team from the state, and Route 17 was crawling with news vans. Locals weren't thrilled, outsiders poking around, asking questions, stirring up old fears. At the diner, a group of old men argued over what the box might hold. "It's gotta be a confession," said one, slamming his mug down. "Someone in this town knows what happened." Another shook his head, muttering about the woods, about how they take what they want. The younger crowd, glued to their phones, shared blurry photos of the outhouse, speculating about ghosts or cover-ups. But one name kept coming up, Daniel Holt, a former deputy who'd worked with Amos back in the day. Holt had quit the force a year after the disappearance, moved to a cabin upstate, and hadn't been seen in Mercy since. Rumor was, he'd been too close to the case, knew too much. Some said he'd been Amos's best friend, others said he'd been jealous, always in Amos's shadow. Tim Hayes remembered Holt gruff, chain-smoking, with a temper that flared when he drank. Tim tracked down Holt's old address, but the cabin was empty, the windows boarded up. A neighbor said Holt had left months ago, talking about making things right. Right about what? Tim wondered. And why now? The Miller farm itself was a character in this drama, its history tangled like the vines choking its fences. Old Man Miller, the last to live there, had been a hard man, quick with his fists and slow to trust. His wife, Mary, had left him in '82, taking their kids and never looking back. The farm went to ruin after that, but the rumors didn't stop. Folks said Miller had been mixed up in something shady, smuggling, maybe, or worse. The barn, with its sagging roof and padlocked doors, was where the stories converged. Kids swore they'd seen lights in there, even after the place was abandoned. Amos and Clara had checked the farm a few times before that night, responding to calls about trespassers or strange noises. They'd never found anything, but Clara had told Tim once, half joking, that the place gave her the creeps. Like someone's watching you, she'd said. Now, with the outhouse in the spotlight, people started wondering about the barn again. Was the box a decoy? Was the real secret hidden somewhere else on the property? A few bold teenagers tried sneaking past the deputies, but they were caught, sent home with warnings. One, a girl named Sarah, swore she'd heard a low hum coming from the barn, like a machine running underground. Nobody believed her, but Tim filed it away, another piece in a puzzle that didn't fit. June Reed, meanwhile, was chasing her own leads. She'd started going through Amos's old things, pulling boxes from the attic, looking for anything that might explain why he'd been so preoccupied that summer. She found a notebook, tucked inside a pair of his old boots, filled with his neat, slanted handwriting. Most of it was mundane case notes, grocery lists, but a few pages stood out. Amos had written about the Miller farm, circling the name Holt and underlining check the barn. There were dates, too, from the weeks before he vanished, next to phrases like lights again and who's watching. June's heart sank. Had Amos been investigating something on his own? Something he hadn't told Clara? Or worse, something he'd trusted the wrong person with? She took the notebook to the sheriff's office, but the new sheriff, a young guy named Carter, brushed it off. Old notes, June, he said gently. Doesn't mean much. But June wasn't so sure. She remembered Daniel Holt, how he'd stopped coming by the house after Amos disappeared, how he'd avoided her eyes at the vigils. Was Holt the key? Or was she grasping at straws, desperate for anything that felt like progress? Marcus Tate's life was starting to unravel, too. He couldn't stop thinking about Mercy County, about Ellen, about the note. His girlfriend, Lena, noticed the change. He was distracted, checking his phone late at night, searching for updates on the case. "What's this got to do with you?" she asked, frustrated. Marcus didn't have an answer, not a good one. But he couldn't let it go. He called in sick one day and drove to Mercy, an hour's trip that felt like crossing a line. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he ended up at the diner, sitting in a corner booth, listening to the locals talk. They didn't notice him, a stranger in a hoodie, but he heard enough to make his skin crawl. Names he didn't know: Amos, Clara, Holt, mixed with words like curse and buried. He overheard a woman mention Ellen Carver, just once, in a hushed tone. She was trouble, always was. Marcus's heart raced. He wanted to ask, but something held him back. Instead, he drove out to Route 17, parking near the Miller farm, staring at the police tape fluttering in the wind. The woods were thick, silent, and for a moment, he thought he saw a light, faint and flickering, deep among the trees. He blinked, and it was gone. The conflict in Mercy wasn't just about a missing sheriff and deputy anymore. It was about trust, about who knew what and who'd kept quiet. Tim suspected Holt, June suspected Amos had been onto something, and Marcus suspected his own past was tangled in ways he didn't understand. The town itself was split. Some wanted the truth, no matter how ugly. Others wanted the box buried again, the case left alone. Old man Jenkins, still smoking on his porch, told anyone who'd listen that the woods weren't right, that they'd taken Amos and Clara and would take more if people kept digging. Sarah, the teenager, started a blog, posting about the hum she'd heard, drawing a small but obsessive following online. Even Sheriff Carter, young and out of his depth, felt the pressure. He'd grown up hearing about Amos Reed, the legend, and now he was stuck guarding a secret he didn't fully understand. The box was locked away in evidence, its contents known only to a few, but leaks were starting to spread. A deputy, off the record, told a reporter it was a letter, addressed to someone in town. Another said it was a photograph, showing faces no one expected. The truth, whatever it was slipping out, and with it, the fragile piece Mercy County had clung to for 16 years. As the days passed, the lights in the woods grew bolder. More people saw them: truckers on Route 17, kids riding bikes, even Sheriff Carter, who didn't believe in ghosts. The hum Sarah had heard was reported again, faint but unmistakable, like something alive under the earth. Tim kept digging, Marcus kept searching, and June kept praying, but the answers stayed just out of reach. The Miller farm loomed larger, its secrets locked in the barn, the outhouse, the woods. What had Amos and Clara found that night? Why had Ellen Carver disappeared? And what was in that box, scratched with an A, that had the power to tear Mercy County apart? The tension was a live wire, sparking with every new rumor, every new lead. The truth was coming, but it wasn't going to be kind. Mercy County was unraveling, thread by thread, as the mystery of Amos Reed and Clara Hayes tightened its grip. The outhouse discovery had lit a fuse, and now, weeks later, the town was teetering on the edge of something explosive. The diner buzzed with nervous energy, locals swapping stories that grew wilder by the day: a letter in the rusted box naming a killer, a photograph showing Amos and Clara alive, a map to a secret buried deep in the Miller farm's woods. The sheriff's office was a fortress, with Sheriff Carter dodging reporters and their endless questions about what was in that box. The police tape around the farm fluttered in the October wind, a constant reminder that answers were close, but not close enough. Route 17, once just a quiet stretch of road, now felt like a line drawn between the town and its secrets. Every night, more people claimed to see those flickering lights in the woods, and the strange hum Sarah had heard was no longer dismissed as a teenager's imagination. It was real, low and steady, like a heartbeat under the earth. Mercy wasn't just haunted by its past, it was alive with it, and the weight of 16 years was pressing down hard. June Reed couldn't sit still anymore. She'd spent days poring over Amos's old notebook, its pages worn from her touch. Those cryptic notes, check the barn, lights again, who's watching, were like a map she couldn't read. She'd started driving out to Route 17 at night, parking near the Miller farm, staring into the dark. She didn't tell anyone, not even Tim, but she felt Amos out there, like he was trying to tell her something. One night, she saw the lights herself, a faint, greenish glow, pulsing through the trees. Her heart pounded, but she didn't move. She wanted to run toward it, to scream Amos's name, but fear glued her to the spot. Instead, she went back to the notebook, noticing a new detail, a phone number, scribbled in the margin, half-faded. She dialed it, her hands shaking, but it was disconnected. Still, she recognized the area code. It was from the city, an hour away, where Ellen Carver had been living in 2009. June's mind raced. Had Amos been in contact with Ellen? Was she part of whatever he'd been chasing that summer? June didn't know, but she wasn't waiting for the sheriff's office to figure it out. She slipped the notebook into her purse and started asking around town about Ellen, hoping someone remembered her. Tim Hayes was chasing his own answers, and he was getting reckless. He'd started sneaking onto the Miller farm at night, ducking under the police tape when the deputies changed shifts. The outhouse was locked tight now, guarded by a padlock and a camera, but Tim wasn't interested in it anymore. His gut told him the barn was where the truth lay. Clara had mentioned it once, how it gave her chills, how the padlock on its doors looked too new for an abandoned place. Tim brought a flashlight and a crowbar, his heart hammering as he crept through the tall grass. The barn loomed ahead, its sagging roof black against the moonless sky. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the ground, making his teeth ache. He pried at the padlock, but it wouldn't budge. Then he heard it, a rustle, not from the wind, but from inside the barn. He froze, his breath catching. "Clara," he whispered, half expecting an answer. Nothing came, but the hum grew stronger, and for a moment, he swore he saw a shadow move behind the barn's cracked windows. He backed away, his crowbar slipping from his hand, and ran back to his truck. He didn't tell anyone what he'd heard, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still out there, watching. Marcus Tate was in deeper than he'd ever meant to be. He'd come to Mercy County on a whim, driven by that nagging feeling about Ellen's note, but now he was hooked. He'd spent days at the diner, listening, piecing things together. The locals didn't know him, which made it easier to blend in, but he felt their eyes on him, a stranger in a town that didn't trust outsiders. He'd started asking questions, careful at first, about Ellen Carver and the Miller farm. Most folks clammed up, but one waitress, a woman named Betty who'd worked there since the 80s, let something slip. Ellen was trouble, she said, wiping down the counter. Always hanging around the wrong people, back before she left town. When Marcus pressed her, asking who those people were, Betty's face closed off. "You don't want to go digging in that," she warned. But Marcus couldn't stop. He found an old phone book in the library, its pages yellowed, and there it was, Ellen's name, listed with an address near the Miller farm. It was a lead, a thin one, but it was enough to send him out to Route 17, standing at the edge of the woods, staring at the same police tape Tim had ducked under. The note in his wallet felt heavy, like it was pulling him toward something he wasn't ready to face. The town was fracturing under the weight of its own secrets. Sheriff Carter was under fire, with locals demanding answers he didn't have. The state investigators were still at the farm, combing through the outhouse, the barn, the woods, but they weren't sharing anything. Rumors about Daniel Holt, the former deputy, were growing louder. Some said he'd been seen in a nearby town, buying supplies and acting cagey. Others swore he'd been at the farm the night Amos and Clara disappeared, though no one could prove it. Tim tracked down Holt's sister, a quiet woman who ran a gas station 20 miles away. She didn't want to talk, but Tim wouldn't leave. "He's gone," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Left a month ago, said he had to fix something from a long time back." Tim pressed her, asking if it was about Amos and Clara, but she shook her head and shut the door. Tim wasn't convinced. He started to wonder if Holt had left that box in the outhouse, if he'd been carrying a secret all these years. But why now? What had changed to make Holt come back or to make him run? Sarah, the teenager who'd heard the hum, was stirring up her own trouble. Her blog had gone viral in Mercy, with kids sharing it on their phones, adding their own stories about the Miller farm. One posted about a strange symbol carved into a tree near the barn, a circle with a slash through it. Another claimed their dad, a hunter, had found a trapdoor in system door in the woods years ago, hidden under leaves and branches. Sarah's posts were getting attention, but they were also making people nervous. Parents told her to stop, saying she was scaring folks, but Sarah wasn't backing down. She'd gone back to the farm herself, sneaking past the deputies with a friend, and found that symbol on the tree. It wasn't random graffiti, it looked old, deliberate, like it meant something. She posted a photo, and the comments exploded with theories. Some said it was a hobo mark, others called it a cult symbol. Sarah didn't know what to believe, but she started noticing things, cars slowing down near her house, a man watching her from across the street at the diner. She told Tim about it, and he listened, his jaw tight. That symbol, the hum, the lights, it was all connected, he was sure of it. He just didn't know how. June's search for answers was taking her to places she'd never expected. The phone number in Amos's notebook led her to a dead end, but it got her thinking about Ellen Carver's time in Mercy. She remembered Ellen as a quiet girl, always on the edge of things, never quite fitting in. June dug through old town records at the library, finding a mention of Ellen's family in a property dispute over the Miller farm. It was vague, but it suggested bad blood, maybe even a reason for Ellen to leave town. June started to wonder if Amos had been looking into that dispute, if it had something to do with why he and Clara went to the farm that night. She called Tim, telling him about the notebook, the number, the connection to Ellen. Tim's eyes lit up, he'd been chasing the same threads, and now they were starting to weave together. But June was scared. The more she dug, the more she felt like someone was watching her, too. A black sedan had been parked outside the bakery too long the other day, its windows tinted. She wrote down the license plate, but when she called the sheriff's office, they said it was nothing. June wasn't so sure. Marcus was out of his depth, but he couldn't turn back. He'd gone to Ellen's old address, a rundown house just outside Mercy. It was empty now, the windows boarded up, but a neighbor, an old woman with sharp eyes, remembered Ellen. She left in a hurry, the woman said, right after that sheriff went missing. Never said why. Marcus's stomach twisted. He asked if Ellen had ever mentioned the Miller farm, and the woman's face changed. Stay away from that place, she said, her voice low. It's no good. Marcus didn't push her, but he drove back to the farm, parking farther down Route 17 this time. He didn't cross the tape, he'd learned his lesson from Tim's stories, but he watched the woods. The lights were there again, stronger now, moving like they were searching for something. The hum was faint, but it was there, vibrating through the soles of his boots. He clutched the note in his pocket, its words burned into his memory. It wasn't just a kind gesture, it was a clue, a piece of this puzzle. But what did it mean? And why did he feel like he was being pulled deeper into something he couldn't escape? The town was a pressure cooker, ready to burst. Sheriff Carter was getting calls from the state, from reporters, from locals demanding to know what was in that box. He'd seen it himself, a letter, handwritten, with names that made his blood run cold. He hadn't told anyone, not even his deputies, but the secret was heavy. The box had been hidden for a reason, and Carter was starting to think it wasn't just about Amos and Clara. It was bigger, tied to the town's past, to the Miller farm, to people who still lived in Mercy. He'd found Daniel Holt's name in old case files, linked to a report about the farm from 2008. Holt had been out there, investigating something off the books. Carter didn't know what, but he was starting to suspect Holt knew more than he'd let on. He tried calling Holt's old number, but it was disconnected. He sent a deputy to check Holt's cabin upstate empty, just like Tim had said. Carter felt the walls closing in. The hum, the lights, the symbol, they were all pointing to something, but he didn't know what. And he was running out of time. Tim wasn't sleeping. He'd gone back to the barn 3 nights in a row, each time hearing that rustle, seeing that shadow. Last night, he'd gotten closer, close enough to see the padlock was rusted but new, like someone had replaced it recently. He'd brought bolt cutters this time, his hand steady despite the fear. The hum was louder now, almost deafening, and the lights were brighter, circling the barn like fireflies. He was about to cut the lock when he heard a twig snap behind him. He spun around, his flashlight catching a glimpse of a figure, tall, thin, moving fast. "Hey!" Tim shouted, but the figure was gone, swallowed by the woods. His heart was racing, but he didn't follow. Instead, he ran back to his truck, his mind spinning. Was it Holt? Someone else? And what were they hiding in that barn? He called Sarah, told her to meet him at the diner. They needed to talk, to compare notes, to figure out what was going on before it was too late. June, Tim, Marcus, Sarah, they were all circling the same truth, but none of them could see it clearly. June found a photo in Amos's things, tucked in the back of the notebook, showing him and Holt standing in front of the Miller farm, their faces grim. Tim found a match for that symbol Sarah had posted, a mark used by a group tied to the farm in the 80s, something the town had buried. Marcus, driven by Ellen's note, found a record of a baby born in 2009, no mother listed, but the hospital was in the city where Ellen had lived. And Carter, staring at that letter in the evidence room, knew one of the names on it, a name still whispered in Merce's darkest corners. The hum was growing, the lights were brighter, and the barn was calling. Something was about to break, something that had been hidden for 16 years. The truth was there, in the shadows of the Miller farm, but it wasn't going to come quietly. The air in Mercy County was thick with secrets, and the Miller farm was at the heart of it all, its barn a silent sentinel guarding truths nobody was ready to face. June Reed clutched the photograph of Amos and Daniel Holt, their faces grim against the backdrop of that cursed property, her fingers tracing the edges as if she could pull her husband back from 2009. Tim Hayes, still shaken from his encounter at the barn, sat across from Sarah in the diner, their voices low as they pieced together the symbol, the hum, the lights, clues that felt like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Marcus Tate, a stranger to this town but no stranger to its pull, stood at the edge of Route 17, Ellen Carver's note burning a hole in his pocket, its words whispering connections he couldn't yet grasp. Sheriff Carter, alone in the evidence room, stared at the letter from the outhouse, its names searing into his mind, each one a thread tying back to Merce's darkest corners. The hum from the farm was louder now, a low thrum that seemed to vibrate through the town itself, and the lights in the woods danced with a purpose, as if they were calling everyone closer. But just when it seemed the truth was within reach, a second shock hit Mercy County, one that turned the mystery upside down and raised the stakes to a breaking point. It started with a phone call to the sheriff's office, just after midnight. A trucker, pulled over on Route 17 to fix a flat, had seen something in the woods, not just lights, but a figure, carrying what looked like a shovel, moving toward the barn. The trucker's voice was shaky, his words spilling out fast. "I thought it was a hunter at first, but he was digging, Sheriff. Right by that old farm. And he didn't look right, like he wasn't all there." Carter dispatched a deputy to check it out, but when they arrived, the figure was gone. What they found instead was a fresh patch of disturbed earth, just behind the barn, marked with that same circle and slash symbol Sarah had posted online. The deputy called it in, and by morning, the farm was swarming with investigators again, their flashlights cutting through the fog. The dirt wasn't just disturbed, it was a hole, shallow but deliberate, and at the bottom was a single item, a woman's scarf, faded but intact, stained with something dark. Carter's stomach dropped when he saw it. He recognized it from old case photos. It was Clara Hayes's, the one she'd worn the night she vanished. The town erupted. Clara's scarf, buried 16 years later? Who was digging? And why now? Tim was at the farm before the news even hit the diner, his truck skidding to a stop at the edge of the police tape. His hands shook as he stared at the hole, the scarf now sealed in an evidence bag. He hadn't seen it since he was a kid, but he'd know it anywhere. Clara used to tie it around her ponytail, joking it made her look like a movie star. Seeing it now, unearthed like a ghost, broke something in him. He demanded answers from Carter, his voice cracking. Who put it there? Who's doing this? Carter had no answers, just a grim look and a warning to stay back. But Tim wasn't listening. He'd seen that figure in the woods, too, the night he'd tried to break into the barn. Was it the same person? Was it Holt, back to cover his tracks? Or someone else, someone who'd been watching all along? Tim's mind raced to the symbol, the one tied to the Millers, to the rumors of a group that had operated out of the farm decades ago. He'd found more online. In corners of the internet most people didn't look posts about a secret network, people who'd used the farm as a meeting place, who'd marked their territory with that circle and slash. Was Clara caught up in that? Had Amos known? June was reeling, too. The scarf was a gut punch, proof that Clara had been at the farm, that something had happened there. She went back to Amos's notebook, her hands trembling as she flipped through it again. There, in the back, was a sketch she hadn't noticed before, a rough drawing of the barn, with an arrow pointing to the back, where the hole had just been found. Next to it, Amos had written, "Holt says it's deeper." Deeper what? The hole. The barn. The secrets. June's heart pounded. Had Amos been investigating something with Holt, or against him? She remembered how Holt had changed after the disappearance, how he'd stopped coming to the house, how he'd left town without a word. She drove to the sheriff's office, the notebook in her purse, and demanded to see Carter. Amos knew something, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. He was onto something, and it got him taken. Carter listened, his face tight, but he didn't show her the letter from the outhouse. He couldn't, not yet. But he promised to look into Holt, to track him down. June left, feeling like she was running out of time. Marcus, meanwhile, was spiraling. The news about the scarf hit the city papers, and he saw it online, along with a blurry photo of the hole. He didn't know Clara, but he knew Ellen had ties to the farm, and that note in his pocket was screaming at him now. He'd never told anyone what it said, not even Lena, but it wasn't just a kind word, it was a warning, a plea, something that felt like it was meant for this moment. He went back to the library, digging through old records, and found a bombshell. Ellen's cousin, a man named Ray Miller, had owned the farm before he vanished in the 80s. Ray had been part of a group, the same one tied to that symbol, rumored to be involved in things the town didn't talk about, smuggling, maybe, or something darker. Marcus's hands shook as he read. Ellen had known about the farm, had grown up near it. Had she been running from that past when she gave him the note? Was the note meant to protect him, or to point him toward something? He drove back to Mercy, his heart racing, and went straight to the diner. Betty, the waitress, was there, and this time, he didn't hold back. What did Ellen know about the farm? He asked, his voice low. Betty's eyes widened, but she didn't answer. Instead, she slid a napkin across the counter with an address written on it. Go there, she whispered. But be careful. The address led Marcus to a trailer on the edge of town, its windows dark, its yard overgrown. He knocked, but no one answered. The door was unlocked, and against his better judgment, he stepped inside. It was a mess, papers scattered, furniture tipped over, like someone had left in a hurry. On the table was a photograph, old and creased, showing a group of people standing in front of the Miller barn. Marcus recognized Ellen's face, younger but unmistakable. Next to her was a man who looked like Amos Reed, and another who could have been Holt. But what caught his eye was the background, a faint glow, like the lights people kept seeing, coming from behind the barn. Marcus's breath caught. He pocketed the photo, his mind racing. Was this what Ellen had been running from? Was this why she'd given him the note? He left the trailer, his heart pounding, and drove to Route 17, parking near the farm. The lights were there, brighter than ever, and the hum was a roar now, shaking the ground. He didn't cross the tape, but he felt it, the truth was close, and it was dangerous. Sarah's blog was out of control now, with thousands of followers sharing her posts, some claiming they'd seen the lights, others saying they'd heard the hum. She'd gone back to the farm with her phone, recording the symbol on the tree, the hole, the barn. Her latest post was a video, shaky but clear, showing the lights moving in a pattern, like they were circling something. The comments were wild, people calling it aliens, ghosts, a government cover-up. But Sarah wasn't buying the supernatural stuff. She'd found something else, buried in an old forum post, a mention of tunnels under the Miller farm, used decades ago by that group tied to the symbol. Tunnels that led to the barn, maybe even under it. She told Tim, who was already obsessed with the barn. We need to get inside, she said, her eyes bright with adrenaline. Tim hesitated, he'd seen that figure, felt the weight of those woods, but he agreed. They planned to go back that night, bolt cutters in hand, ready to break into the barn and find whatever Amos and Clara had found. But Sarah was scared, too. She'd seen that man watching her again, the same one from the diner, and now she was sure he was following her. Sheriff Carter was drowning. The letter from the outhouse was locked in a safe, but its words haunted him. It wasn't just a confession, it was a list, names of people in Mercy, people still alive, tied to something that had happened at the farm. Holt's name was there, but so were others, names Carter knew from church, from the diner, from his own childhood. He couldn't trust anyone, not even his deputies. The scarf had changed everything, proof that someone was still moving pieces, still hiding the truth. He'd sent a team to dig deeper behind the barn, but they'd found nothing else, just that shallow hole and the symbol scratched into the dirt. Carter was starting to think the barn was the key, just like Tim and Sarah did. He'd seen Amos's notebook, thanks to June, and that phrase, "Holt says it's deeper," kept circling in his mind. He ordered a search of the barn, but the padlock was tougher than expected, and the hum was making his team uneasy. One deputy swore he'd seen a figure in the woods, just like the trucker had, but when they searched, they found nothing but footprints, too big for Clara, too small for Amos, just like that muddy boot print from 2009. The town was on edge, the diner packed with people who didn't want to be alone. Old man Jenkins, still on his porch, told anyone who'd listen that the woods were angry, that digging up that scarf had woken something up. The lights were brighter, the hum louder, and now people were reporting dreams, nightmares of voices calling from the farm, of shadows moving in the dark. June, Tim, Marcus, Sarah, they were all converging on the same truth, but they weren't ready for what it would cost. June found another note in Amos's things, this one addressed to her, saying, "If I don't come back, don't trust Holt." Tim and Sarah were planning their break-in, unaware that someone was watching, waiting. Marcus was holding a photo that tied Ellen to the farm, to Amos, to a secret that had been buried for decades. And Carter was staring at a list of names, wondering who in Mercy was still hiding the truth. The barn was calling, its padlock ready to break, its secrets ready to spill. The lights circled tighter, the hum grew louder, and the figure in the woods was moving closer. Something was about to happen, something that would change Mercy County forever. The Miller farm was a powder keg, and Mercy County was holding the match. The hum from the barn had become a constant drone, vibrating through the ground, rattling windows along Route 17. The lights in the woods pulsed like a heartbeat, drawing eyes from every corner of town. June Reed sat in her kitchen, Amos's notebook open, her fingers tracing his final note, "If I don't come back, don't trust Holt." Tim Hayes and Sarah, armed with bolt cutters and a desperate need for answers, crept toward the barn under the cover of darkness, their breaths shallow in the cold October air. Marcus Tate, clutching the photograph he'd found in the trailer, stood at the edge of the farm, Ellen's note heavy in his pocket, its words now a map to a truth he could almost see. Sheriff Carter, alone in the evidence room, held the letter from the outhouse, its list of names burning a hole in his conscience. Clara's scarf, unearthed behind the barn, was proof that someone was still playing games, and the figure in the woods was out there, watching, waiting. The town was holding its breath, and tonight, the secrets of 16 years would finally break free. Tim and Sarah reached the barn just after midnight, the hum so loud it drowned out their whispers. The padlock gleamed in Tim's flashlight, newer than the rusted hinges it guarded. Sarah's hands shook as she held the bolt cutters, but Tim nodded, steadying her. "For Clara," he said, and she cut through the lock with a snap that echoed like a gunshot. The barn doors creaked open, revealing a darkness that seemed to swallow the light. Inside, the air was thick, musty, and the hum was deafening, coming from below. They found a trapdoor, half hidden under a pile of rotting hay, marked with the same circle and slash symbol. Tim's heart raced, Sarah's forum post about tunnels had been right. He pried the trapdoor open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the earth. Sarah hesitated, her phone trembling as she recorded. "We shouldn't," she whispered, but Tim was already moving, driven by the sister he'd lost. They climbed down, the hum growing louder, the air colder, until they reached a tunnel, its walls rough and damp. At the end was a small room, lit by a single bulb, and what they saw stopped them cold, a table covered in maps, photographs, and a journal, its pages filled with names Amos, Clara, Holt, Ellen, and others from Mercy. On the wall, a photograph of the barn, with a red X marking the spot where Clara's scarf had been found. Across town, June couldn't wait any longer. She'd called Sheriff Carter, demanding to know about the letter, but he'd dodged her, saying it was sensitive. She wasn't buying it. She drove to the farm, her headlights cutting through the fog, and saw Tim's truck parked near the police tape. Her stomach dropped. Tim was out here, chasing the same truth she was. She slipped past the tape, her heart pounding, and headed for the barn. The doors were open, the hum vibrating through her bones. She called Tim's name, her voice swallowed by the darkness, and then she saw it, a faint light from below, coming from the trapdoor. She descended, her hands shaking, and found Tim and Sarah staring at the table. "June," Tim whispered, his voice raw. He held up the journal, its last entry dated the night Amos and Clara vanished. It was in Amos's handwriting, detailing a meeting at the farm, a confrontation with Holt and others from that old group tied to the symbol. Amos had written, "They're hiding something under the barn. If I don't make it, tell June I'm sorry." June's knees buckled, but she grabbed the table, her eyes locking on a photograph pinned to the wall. Amos and Clara, bound and gagged, in this very room. Marcus was there, too, drawn to the farm like a moth to a flame. He'd followed Betty's address to the trailer, found the photograph, and now he was at the barn, his heart racing as he saw the open doors. Ellen's note had been clear in his mind all these years. "Find the truth, Marcus. It's bigger than you know." He didn't understand it then, but now, standing in the barn, he saw the trapdoors glow and heard the hum. He descended, finding June, Tim, and Sarah in the tunnel room, their faces pale. Marcus held up the photograph from the trailer, showing Ellen with Amos and Holt. "She knew," he said, his voice steady despite the fear. "Ellen was part of this, wasn't she?" June nodded, tears streaming down her face. The journal confirmed it. Ellen had been at the farm that night, caught up in the same group Amos was investigating, a network using the tunnels for something illegal, something worth killing to protect. Clara's scarf, the letter, the photograph, it all pointed to a cover-up, one that had cost Amos and Clara their lives. Sheriff Carter arrived at the farm, alerted by a deputy who'd seen Tim's truck. He found the barn doors open, the trapdoor exposed, and his heart sank. He'd read the letter from the outhouse, a confession from Holt, admitting he'd been part of the group, that he'd helped cover up what happened to Amos and Clara. The letter named others, people still in Mercy, people Carter had known his whole life. He'd kept it quiet, hoping to find Holt first, but now the truth was out. He descended into the tunnel, finding June, Tim, Sarah, and Marcus staring at the evidence. "You shouldn't be here," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Tim rounded on him, holding up the journal. "You knew, didn't you? About Holt, about this place?" Carter shook his head, but his eyes betrayed him. He'd suspected Holt, but he hadn't wanted to believe it. The letter had been clear. Holt and the others had lured Amos and Clara to the farm, confronted them in the tunnel, and when things went wrong, they'd made them disappear. The scarf was a taunt, buried years later by someone, maybe Holt, trying to stir the pot. The climax hit like a freight train. As they stood in the tunnel, the hum stopped, replaced by a low, grinding sound. The walls shook, dust falling from the ceiling, and a hidden door in the room slid open, revealing another tunnel. From the darkness stepped Daniel Holt, older, thinner, his eyes wild. He held a gun, his hands unsteady but his voice cold. "You couldn't leave it alone," he said, looking at Tim, then June. "Amos was too stubborn, just like you." He admitted it all, how the group had been running drugs through the tunnels, how Amos had gotten too close, how Clara had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Holt had tried to warn them, but when they wouldn't back off, the others had taken over. Amos and Clara were gone, their bodies hidden deeper in the tunnels, where no one would find them. Holt had left the box in the outhouse years later, guilt eating at him, hoping someone would dig up the truth. But he hadn't expected this. Tim, June, Sarah, Marcus, all converging on the same secret. June stepped forward, her voice breaking but firm. "You were his friend, Daniel. How could you?" Holt's face crumpled, the gun shaking. "I didn't want it to happen," he said. "They made me." Tim lunged, knocking the gun from Holt's hand, and Carter tackled him, pinning him to the ground. Sarah recorded it all, her phone shaking but steady enough to catch Holt's confession. The truth was out. Amos and Clara had been killed to protect the group's secrets, their bodies hidden in the tunnels, the scarf a cruel reminder from someone who couldn't stay silent. June fell to her knees, sobbing, as Tim held her, his own tears falling. Marcus stood frozen, Ellen's note in his hand, its words finally clear. Find the truth, Marcus. It's bigger than you know. Ellen had known about the group, had tried to escape it, and her note was her way of passing the torch, hoping someone would finish what she couldn't. But then came the twist, the one nobody saw coming. As Carter cuffed Holt, a faint sound echoed from the new tunnel, a voice, weak but unmistakable, calling for help. Tim's head snapped up, his heart stopping. Clara, he whispered, barely daring to hope. He ran toward the sound, the others following, their flashlights cutting through the dark. The tunnel stretched deeper, colder, and at its end was a locked door, the circle and slash symbol carved into it. Tim broke it open, and there, curled in a corner, was Clara Hayes, alive, gaunt, her hair grey, but alive. She'd been held in the tunnels all these years, kept by someone from the group, a prisoner to ensure silence. Her eyes met Tim's, and she whispered his name, her voice a ghost of the sister he'd lost. The room spun as June, Marcus, and Sarah stared, disbelief warring with hope. Carter radioed for backup, his voice shaking. Holt, still cuffed, looked away, muttering, I didn't know she was still here. The climax left Mercy County changed forever. Amos was gone, his body somewhere in the tunnels, but Clara's survival was a miracle, a spark of hope in a town drowned in grief. Holt was arrested, the letter and journal enough to convict him and expose the others named in the Outhouse confession. Marcus finally understood Ellen's note. She'd known about the tunnels, had tried to warn Amos, and had chosen Marcus to carry her truth, hoping he'd find his way to mercy one day. But the twist lingered, a shadow over the resolution. Who had kept Clara alive all those years? Holt swore it wasn't him, and the group he'd named was long gone. The lights in the woods were still there, flickering even now, and the hum hadn't stopped, it had just moved deeper, out of reach. As Clara was carried to an ambulance, her hand clutching Tim's, she whispered something that chilled them all. There's someone else down there. Mercy's secrets weren't all uncovered, and the farm still held its ghosts, waiting for the next soul to dig too deep. The Miller farm was quiet now, the hum gone, the lights in the woods dimmed to nothing. Mercy County, though, was anything but silent. The discovery of Clara Hayes, alive after 16 years in the tunnels beneath the farm, had turned the town upside down. Ambulances and news vans clogged Route 17, their lights flashing against the dawn as Clara was rushed to the hospital, Tim by her side, his hand gripping hers like he was afraid she'd vanish again. June Reed stood outside the barn, Amos's notebook clutched to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she watched the paramedics work. Marcus Tate lingered near the police tape, Ellen's note still in his pocket, its words, find the truth, Marcus. It's bigger than you know, echoing in his mind. Sheriff Carter, his face drawn, coordinated the scene, his radio crackling with updates as state investigators swarmed the tunnels. Daniel Holt, cuffed and silent in the back of a cruiser, stared at the ground, his confession unraveling a web of secrets that had choked Mercy for years. But Clara's final words, there's someone else down there, hung over them all, a shadow that refused to lift. The truth had come at a cost, and Mercy County was about to learn what it meant to face its ghosts. Clara's return was a miracle, but it was a fragile one. At the hospital, doctors worked around the clock, their faces grim as they assessed her condition. She was malnourished, her skin pale from years underground, her eyes haunted by what she'd endured. Tim never left her side, sleeping in a chair by her bed, asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. Slowly, over days, she began to talk. She told Tim about that night in 2009, how she and Amos had gone to the Miller farm after Jenkins's call about the lights. They'd found the trapdoor in the barn, just like Tim and Sarah had, and followed it to the tunnels. Amos had been investigating the farm for months, suspecting it was a hub for a smuggling ring tied to that circle and slash symbol. He'd kept it quiet, even from Clara, until that night, when he'd confided they were meeting someone, a tipster who promised proof. But it was a trap. Holt and others from the group were waiting, and when Amos refused to back off, things turned ugly. Clara didn't remember much after that, just waking up in a locked room, deep in the tunnels, with no way out. She'd been kept alive, fed just enough to survive, by someone she never saw clearly, a figure who spoke in whispers and wore a hood. They wanted me as leverage, she said, her voice barely audible. To keep the town quiet. June listened to Clara's story through Tim, her heart breaking with every word. Amos hadn't made it out of the tunnels that night. His body, Clara said, was somewhere deeper, in a part of the network she'd never been allowed to see. The state investigators searched for days, combing the tunnels with dogs and ground-penetrating radar, but the passages were a maze, branching off in directions no one had mapped. They found Amos's badge, dented and tarnished, in a side tunnel, along with a piece of his jacket, torn and stained. It was enough for June to know he was gone, but not enough to give her closure. She buried the badge in her backyard, under the oak tree where Amos used to sit, and held a quiet memorial at the bakery. The town showed up, filling the shop with flowers and stories, but June felt the weight of that final note in his notebook: "If I don't come back, don't trust Holt." Amos had known he was walking into danger, and he'd gone anyway, trying to protect Mercy from something bigger than himself. June forgave him, but she couldn't forgive the town for its silence, for the secrets it had kept all those years. Tim was torn between relief and rage. Clara was back, but she wasn't the sister he remembered. She flinched at loud noises, stared out windows for hours, and woke up screaming from nightmares about the tunnels. He wanted to fix her, to bring back the Clara who joked about being a movie star, but he knew it would take time. He threw himself into finding answers instead, working with Sarah to dig deeper into the group tied to the symbol. They found old records in the library, hidden in a box of unfiled documents, that linked the Miller farm to a smuggling operation in the 80s. Drugs, mostly, but also weapons, moved through the tunnels to avoid the law. The group had disbanded after Ray Miller, Ellen's cousin, disappeared, but some members stayed in Mercy, blending into the town, their secrets buried with the farm. Holt's confession named 3 others still alive: a local businessman, a retired teacher, and a woman who worked at the post office. Sheriff Carter arrested them quietly, but the news spread fast, and Mercy turned on itself. Neighbors stopped talking, doors stayed locked, and the diner grew quiet, as if the town was ashamed of its own reflection. Marcus Tate's role in the story was harder to unravel. He'd come to Mercy chasing a feeling, driven by Ellen's note, and now he was part of something he couldn't walk away from. He visited Clara in the hospital, showing her the note. "Find the truth, Marcus. It's bigger than you know." Clara's eyes widened. She recognized Ellen's handwriting. She told Marcus that Ellen had been at the farm that night, trying to help Amos, warning him about the group. Ellen had grown up knowing about the tunnels, her cousin Ray's dirty work, and she'd wanted out. She'd met Amos in secret, passing him information, but when the trap was set, she'd barely escaped. Clara didn't know where Ellen had gone after that, but the note made sense now. It was Ellen's way of keeping the truth alive, of trusting a stranger with a kindness she'd never forget. Marcus tracked down the hospital record he'd found, the one about a baby born in 2009 with no mother listed. He went to the city, to the foster home where the child had been raised, and found a 16-year-old girl named Lily, with Ellen's eyes and a quiet strength that reminded him of himself. Lily didn't know her mother, but Marcus gave her the note, telling her it was from someone who'd fought for the truth. He didn't know if Ellen was alive, but he felt her presence in Lily, a legacy of hope in a story of loss. Sheriff Carter was cleaning up the mess, but it wasn't easy. The arrests shook Mercy, exposing how deep the rot had gone. The businessman, a man named Tom Grayson, had been a pillar of the community, funding the town's 4th of July fireworks. The teacher, Ms. Ellis, had taught half the kids in Mercy, her smile hiding a past tied to the tunnels. The post office worker, Linda, broke down in custody, admitting she'd known about the group but stayed silent out of fear. Holt was the key, though his confession laid it all bare. He'd been a reluctant part of the group, pulled in by debts and threats, and when Amos got too close, he'd panicked. The others had handled the rest, and Holt had spent 16 years running from the guilt, leaving the box in the outhouse as a half-hearted attempt at redemption. But Clara's survival was the piece he hadn't expected. He swore he didn't know she was still alive, that someone else had kept her hidden. Carter pressed him, but Holt's answers were vague, his eyes darting to the shadows like he was still afraid. The question of someone else lingered like smoke. Clara's captor, the hooded figure who'd kept her alive, was still a mystery. The tunnels were searched, but they stretched for miles, some collapsing, others leading to dead ends. Investigators found traces of someone living down there, canned food, blankets, a flashlight, but no sign of the person Clara described. Sarah, still blogging, posted about the tunnels, drawing a flood of comments from people claiming to know more. One anonymous user, posting from a burner account, said the group hadn't disbanded completely, that a few members had gone underground, literally keeping the tunnels active. Sarah shared it with Tim, who shared it with Carter, but the account was deleted hours later. The lights in the woods had stopped, the hum was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave Mercy. Carter doubled patrols on Route 17, but he knew the truth. Whoever had kept Clara alive was still out there, a ghost in the system, waiting. June found a kind of peace, though it was bittersweet. She'd lost Amos, but Clara's survival felt like a gift, a piece of him still with her. She visited Clara every day, bringing homemade cookies, telling stories about Amos to help her heal. Clara was slowly coming back to herself, her laugh starting to sound like the old Clara, though her eyes still carried the tunnel's weight. June sold the bakery, unable to keep up the long hours, and used the money to start a scholarship in Amos's name, for kids like Marcus who needed a chance. She kept his notebook on her nightstand, a reminder of the man who'd fought for Mercy, even when it cost him everything. Tim, too, was finding his way. He moved in with Clara, helping her adjust, taking her for walks along the river where they'd played as kids. He stopped sneaking onto the farm, but he never stopped wondering about that figure in the woods, the one he'd seen the night he tried to break into the barn. Was it the captor? Someone else from the group? He'd never know, but he kept Clara close, determined to protect her this time. Marcus went back to the city, his life changed by Mercy. He told Lena everything about Ellen, the note, the farm, and she listened, her hand in his. He'd found Lily, given her the truth about her mother, and promised to stay in touch. The note was still in his wallet, but it didn't feel heavy anymore, it felt like purpose. He started volunteering at a community center, helping kids like he'd been, telling them one act of kindness could change everything. He thought about Ellen often, wondering where she was, if she'd known her note would lead him here. He checked the trailer one last time, finding a letter tucked under a floorboard, addressed to him. It was from Ellen, written years ago, saying she'd left Mercy to protect her baby, to break free from the group's shadow. "You're stronger than you know," she wrote. "Keep the truth alive." Marcus cried reading it, knowing he'd done what she'd asked. Sarah's blog became a book deal, her story of the Miller farm drawing readers from across the country. She wrote about Amos and Clara, about the tunnels, about the town that had hidden its secrets for too long. She included the symbol, the lights, the hum, but left out the wilder theories, focusing on the people, June's grief, Tim's loyalty, Marcus's courage, Clara's survival. She dedicated it to Mercy, a town that had learned to face its past. But she kept one secret for herself, a late-night message from that anonymous user, claiming the tunnels went deeper than anyone knew, connecting to other farms, other towns. Sarah didn't post it, she wasn't sure she believed it, but she kept it, just in case. Sheriff Carter stayed on, though the case aged him. He made the arrests public, letting Mercy see the truth, even if it hurt. The businessman, teacher, and post office worker were convicted, their sentences long but not long enough for some. Holt got life, his confession sparing him worse. Carter sealed the tunnels, or tried to, but some passages were too unstable, collapsing under their own weight. He never found Clara's captor, though he kept a file open, just in case. The farm was left alone, the barn boarded up, the outhouse torn down. The lights and hum didn't return, but Carter drove Route 17 every night, watching the woods, knowing Mercy's ghosts weren't all gone. Mercy County healed, slowly. The diner filled up again, conversations turning to football and harvests, though the farm was never far from people's minds. June, Tim, Clara, Marcus, they carried the scars, but they also carried hope. Clara started therapy, learning to live above ground again. Tim proposed to his girlfriend, wanting a future beyond the past. Marcus mentored kids, passing on Ellen's legacy. June planted flowers around Amos's oak tree, a quiet tribute. The key takeaway was simple but heavy: the truth matters, even when it hurts. Mercy had hidden its secrets too long, but facing them brought Clara back, gave Amos's death meaning, and showed a town what it could be. The final twist, Clara's captor, still out there, lingered like a whisper, a reminder that some mysteries don't fully resolve. But for now, Mercy County could breathe, its heart beating a little stronger, its ghosts a little quieter, under the wide, open sky.